Have you ever wondered what would happen if you discovered that the person you hated most in the world was actually the one who saved what you loved most? What if everything you believed about your enemy was completely wrong? Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me, where are you watching this from today? Are you from Russia, Ukraine, or maybe somewhere completely different? Have you ever experienced a moment where someone you thought was your enemy turned out to be something completely unexpected? Let me know in the comments, because today's story will challenge everything you think you know about war, enemies, and the power of human connection. This is about Dr. Mikhail Petrov, a Russian surgeon who made a decision in an operating room that left his entire medical team speechless. But what he discovered about his patient that day changed everything he thought he knew about hatred and mercy. And I promise you, by the time I finish telling you this story, you'll never look at the concept of enemies the same way again. Now I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you're a father, and the most precious thing in your life, your only son, has been taken from you by people you consider your worst enemies. Imagine living for 8 months not knowing if he's alive or dead. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Mikhail Petrov. Dr. Mikhail worked at Rostov Regional Hospital, just 60 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. At 45 years old, he had dedicated his entire life to saving others. He was respected by his colleagues, loved by his patients, and known throughout the hospital as a man who would do anything to preserve human life. But 3 years ago, this war took everything from him. His only son Pavel was captured during a military operation near the front lines. The official reports were devastating. Pavel's unit had been ambushed. Most soldiers died instantly, and Pavel was listed as missing, presumed dead. For 8 agonizing months, Mikhail lived in a nightmare. Every morning he woke up hoping for news. Every evening he went to bed wondering if his son was suffering somewhere in Ukrainian captivity. The uncertainty was slowly destroying him from the inside. Then, like a miracle that seemed impossible, Pavel returned home. He had escaped from Ukrainian detention with help from someone he would only describe as an angel in uniform, a Ukrainian soldier who had risked everything to help him get back to his family. But here's what shattered Mikhail's heart. Pavel came back broken. The confident, happy young man who had left for military service returned as a traumatized shell of himself. Nightmares every night, panic attacks, the inability to be touched without flinching. Mikhail watched his son become afraid of his own shadow, destroyed by whatever the Ukrainians had done to him during those 8 months. This tragedy hardened Mikhail's heart against all Ukrainian forces. In his mind, they were monsters who had stolen his son's innocence and left him psychologically shattered. Every Ukrainian soldier was responsible for Pavel's suffering. But what Mikhail didn't know was that his entire understanding of what had happened to his son was about to be turned completely upside down. February 15, 2024. It was a typical winter day at Rostov Regional Hospital. Snow was falling heavily outside when suddenly, the sound of helicopter blades cut through the winter air above the hospital. Emergency helicopters usually meant one thing: critical military casualties that couldn't wait for ground transport. Nurse Elena Kozlova, who had worked with Mikhail for over 15 years, burst into the surgical wing with urgent news. Emergency incoming, critical trauma case, military casualty being airlifted. Mikhail felt his stomach tighten. Military casualties were always emotionally difficult, especially given what had happened to Pavel. But he was a professional, and his job was to save lives regardless of the circumstances. But when Elena received the full details over the radio, something happened that made Mikhail's blood run cold. Elena's face went completely pale as she listened to the helicopter crew's report. She pulled Mikhail aside and whispered words that hit him like a physical blow.
Dr. Petrov, the incoming patient, he's Ukrainian military, severe injuries, unconscious, barely alive.
For a moment, Mikhail couldn't process what he had just heard. A Ukrainian soldier was being brought to his hospital. One of the people responsible for his son's trauma was about to be placed under his care. The familiar rage that had been building in Mikhail's heart for 3 years suddenly exploded to the surface. This was one of them. One of the enemies who had broken his son, and now this enemy expected Mikhail to save his life? Let the administration decide if we have resources for enemy combatants, Mikhail said, his voice colder than Elena had ever heard it. But Elena's next words hit him like a hammer. Doctor, he's dying. The helicopter crew says he won't make it to another hospital. We're his only chance. 5 minutes later, the trauma bay doors exploded open, and what Mikhail saw changed everything. On the stretcher was not some hardened enemy warrior, but a young man who couldn't have been older than Pavel. The Ukrainian soldier's uniform was shredded by shrapnel, his face was covered in blood and dirt, and his breathing was so shallow that each breath might have been his last. The helicopter medic approached Mikhail with the grim efficiency of someone who had delivered too much bad news. Doctor, this is Captain Alexei Volkov, Ukrainian Army, 72nd Mechanized Brigade. Multiple shrapnel wounds, massive internal bleeding, severe blood loss. He needs surgery immediately, or he's not going to make it.
Something about that name, Alexei Volkov, stirred a memory in the back of Mikhail's mind. But in the chaos and emotion of the moment, he couldn't place where he had heard it before. Looking down at the dying soldier, seeing how young he was, seeing how much he resembled Pavel, should have awakened Mikhail's medical instincts, should have reminded him of the oath he had taken to preserve all human life. But all Mikhail could think about was Pavel, broken and traumatized, waking up screaming from nightmares about Ukrainian captivity. And then Mikhail made a decision that shocked everyone in the trauma bay. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back from the stretcher. "We have limited surgical capacity today. We need to prioritize Russian casualties. Transfer him to another facility." The silence that followed was deafening. Nurse Elena stared at Mikhail in complete disbelief. In 15 years of working together, through hundreds of emergency cases, she had never, not once, seen him refuse to treat a patient, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "Dr. Petrov," Elena said carefully, "there is no other facility within range. The next hospital is 3 hours away by road in this weather. He won't survive the transport." The helicopter medic nodded grimly. "She's right, Doc. This guy is barely hanging on as it is. Move him again, and he's guaranteed dead." Mikhail felt the eyes of his entire medical team on him. His surgical residents, Dr. Anna Volina and Dr. Igor Semenov, were waiting for his decision, with expressions of growing horror. The anesthesiologist had already begun preparing his equipment, assuming they would proceed with surgery as they always did. But Mikhail's heart was stone. All he could see was Pavel's haunted eyes, the way his son flinched when someone approached him too quickly, the way Pavel had aged 10 years in the 8 months of his captivity. "Find another solution," Mikhail said firmly. "I won't waste our resources on someone who was probably shooting at our people yesterday." Dr. Anna Volina, a young surgical resident who had always looked up to Mikhail as her mentor and moral compass, approached him with tears starting to form in her eyes.
"Dr. Petrov," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I understand your personal feelings about this situation. We all know what happened to Pavel, but this soldier is dying right in front of us. How can we call ourselves doctors if we let someone die when we have the power to save them?" Mikhail felt a surge of anger at his resident's words. How dare she bring up Pavel? How dare she judge his decision when she had never lost a child to this war? When she had never watched her son wake up screaming night after night because of what these people had done to him. "Dr. Volina," he said sharply, "you are not the attending physician here. I am, and I have made my decision based on the reality of our situation." But even as he spoke the words, Mikhail could see the disappointment and confusion in the eyes of his entire medical team. These were people who had worked with him for years, who respected him not just as a surgeon, but as a man of principle and compassion. Now they were witnessing a side of him they had never seen before, and it terrified them. The helicopter medic, growing more frustrated with each passing minute, pulled out his radio and began contacting other medical facilities. But the responses were always the same: too far away, too dangerous to transport in current weather conditions, patient too unstable to survive additional travel time. "Doctor," the medic said desperately, "I've contacted every hospital within 200 kilometers. Nobody can take him. You're literally his only chance at survival." As the debate continued around him, as his team looked at him with growing disappointment, as the monitors attached to the Ukrainian soldier began showing increasingly dangerous vital signs, Mikhail noticed something that would change everything. The Ukrainian soldier's jacket had fallen open during transport, revealing several personal items scattered on the stretcher. Among them was a small, blood-stained notebook that had apparently been tucked in the soldier's breast pocket. Something compelled Mikhail to pick up that notebook. Maybe it was medical curiosity about the patient's identity. Maybe it was the need to understand who this enemy soldier really was. Maybe it was just the instinct to gather all available information before making a final decision. But as Mikhail opened the cover of that notebook, something happened that no one in that trauma bay could have predicted. His hands began to tremble, his face went completely white, his eyes filled with tears. And then, for the first time in his 20-year medical career, Dr. Mikhail Petrov broke down completely in front of his entire surgical team. What was written inside that notebook that could cause such a dramatic reaction? What could possibly transform a hardened, angry surgeon into a man on the verge of emotional collapse? The answer was written in careful Cyrillic letters on the inside front cover. "To my guardian angel, Captain Alexei Volkov, thank you for giving me back my life and my father. Your courage saved not just me but our entire family. I will never forget what you risked for a stranger who was supposed to be your enemy. Pavel Petrov, 15th Reconnaissance Battalion." This was Pavel's handwriting. This was Pavel's gratitude letter. The dying Ukrainian soldier lying on the stretcher in front of him was the angel in uniform who had saved his son's life. The notebook slipped from Mikhail's trembling fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the trauma bay like a gunshot. Every person in that room watched as their respected chief surgeon faced a realization that shattered everything he thought he knew about enemies and heroes. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, Mikhail stood frozen between two impossible realities. The Ukrainian soldier he had been prepared to let die out of hatred and prejudice was actually the hero who had given him back his son. The enemy he had refused to treat was the reason Pavel was alive and home today.
Dr. Anna Volina watched in complete confusion as her mentor's face transformed from cold determination to absolute emotional devastation. Dr. Petrov, what's wrong? What did you find in that notebook? But Mikhail couldn't speak. He couldn't explain. All he could do was stare at the unconscious face of Captain Alexei Volkov and remember Pavel's words about the Ukrainian soldier who had risked everything to help him escape. Dad, he could have left me to die and saved himself, but he came back for me. He said every son deserves a chance to see his father again. The monitors around Captain Volkov began beeping more urgently. His blood pressure was dropping rapidly. His pulse was becoming dangerously erratic. According to every medical indicator, he was perhaps 2 or 3 minutes away from complete cardiac arrest. Doctor, Elena shouted above the noise of the alarms. We need to make a decision right now. Mikhail wiped the tears from his eyes and looked around at his medical team. These people who had just watched him nearly make the greatest moral mistake of his life. These professionals who were waiting for him to remember who he really was beneath all the pain and anger. Prep or 3 immediately, Mikhail said, his voice breaking with emotion. Clear my entire schedule. Cancel everything. We have the most important life of my career to save. The transformation in the trauma bay was instantaneous and electric.
Nurses sprang into action with renewed energy. Surgical residents began preparing equipment with focused determination, and the anesthesiologists started calculating medication dosages. But everyone could see that something profound and life-changing had just happened to their chief surgeon, even if they didn't understand exactly what. As they rushed Captain Volkov toward the operating room, Elena grabbed Mikhail's arm. "Doctor, what changed your mind? What was in that notebook that made you react like that?" Mikhail looked at her with tears still streaming down his face, his voice heavy with shame and gratitude. "Elena, I just learned the most important lesson of my life about the difference between enemies and angels. And I almost let my hatred destroy the life of the man who saved everything I love." The surgery that followed lasted 7.5 hours. 7.5 hours during which Mikhail worked with a precision, dedication, and desperate focus that amazed even his most experienced surgical team. Every suture was perfect, every decision was flawless, every movement was driven by an overwhelming need to save the life of the man who had shown mercy to Pavel when he could have easily left him to die. 3 times during the operation, Captain Volkov's heart stopped. 3 times Mikhail brought him back from the edge of death, refusing to let the man who had saved his son slip away because of his own initial blindness and hatred. When the surgery was finally complete, when all the shrapnel had been removed and all the internal bleeding had been stopped, Mikhail collapsed into a chair in the recovery room, physically and emotionally exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced. Captain Volkov was stable, alive, and expected to make a full recovery. The man who had saved Pavel would live to see another day because in the end, mercy had triumphed over hatred. Dr. Anna Volina approached her mentor cautiously. "Dr. Petrov, that was the most incredible surgical work I've ever witnessed, but I've never seen you react to a patient like that. Who was he really? What made this case so different?" Mikhail looked through the recovery room window at the sleeping face of Captain Alexei Volkov, this young Ukrainian officer who had taught him that courage and compassion recognize no borders, no uniforms, no nationalities. "Anna," Mikhail said simply, "he was my son's guardian angel. And I almost let him die because I was too blinded by hatred to see that heroes don't always wear the uniform you expect them to wear." 2 days later, Captain Volkov regained consciousness. The first words out of his mouth were completely typical of the man Pavel had described. "Doctor, how are the other patients? Are there people who need this bed more than I do? Even barely conscious, even after nearly dying?" His first concern was for others. Mikhail sat beside his bed with Pavel's blood-stained notebook in his hands, trying to find the words for what he needed to say. "Captain Volkov, I have something that belongs to you," Mikhail said, holding up the notebook. When Alexei saw the notebook and recognized Pavel's careful handwriting, his eyes immediately filled with tears. "You're Pavel's father, Dr. Petrov?" "I am, and I owe you an apology that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for." Alexei struggled to sit up despite his injuries. "Doctor, you saved my life. You operated on me for over 7 hours. You have absolutely nothing to apologize for." "You don't understand," Mikhail said, his voice heavy with shame that would stay with him forever. "When you were first brought in, when I didn't know who you were, I refused to treat you. I was ready to let you die because you were Ukrainian. Because I blamed all Ukrainian soldiers for what had happened to Pavel. I nearly let my hatred destroy the life of the man who gave me back everything I love in this world." The recovery room fell completely silent as the weight of Mikhail's confession settled between them like a physical presence. "But you did treat me," Alexei said softly, his voice filled with understanding rather than anger. "You saved my life when you could have let me die. That's what matters. Only because I found Pavel's letter to you. Only because I discovered at the last possible moment that the enemy I was prepared to abandon was actually the hero who had saved my son."
If I hadn't seen that notebook, if I hadn't learned who you really were. Mikhail's voice trailed off as he contemplated the horrible alternate reality. Alexei was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then he said something that would stay with Mikhail for the rest of his life. "Doctor, maybe that's exactly why I was brought to your hospital instead of dying somewhere else. Maybe we both needed to learn that our enemies are often just people we haven't taken the time to understand yet." When Pavel arrived at the hospital that afternoon to visit his father, he found Mikhail sitting beside Captain Volkov's bed, the two men deep in conversation about war, peace, family, and the power of human connection to bridge any divide. The moment Pavel walked through the door and saw Alexei, his face lit up with pure recognition and gratitude. "Captain, you're alive! You're really alive!" Pavel rushed to embrace the man who had saved his life, and watching his son hug the Ukrainian soldier he had almost refused to treat, Mikhail understood something fundamental about the human condition. War creates enemies, but mercy creates family. Captain Alexei Volkov recovered fully from his injuries, and was eventually repatriated through a prisoner exchange program. But before he left Rostov Regional Hospital, he spent several days talking with both Mikhail and Pavel about their experiences, their hopes for peace, and their shared belief that understanding between people is always possible, even in the darkest and most divided times. The blood-stained notebook that had revealed the truth remained in Mikhail's possession, kept as a permanent reminder that heroes come in all uniforms, speak all languages, and serve all flags. A reminder that sometimes the people we think are our greatest enemies turn out to be our greatest blessings. Dr. Mikhail Petrov continued working at Rostov Regional Hospital, but with a completely transformed perspective on his calling as a healer. He began advocating for treating all war casualties equally, regardless of nationality or uniform. His story spread throughout the medical community, inspiring other doctors to remember that the obligation to heal knows no borders. And Pavel, he slowly recovered from his trauma, helped immeasurably by knowing that the man who had saved him was also saved by his father. The circle of mercy, he said, was sometimes the only thing that made sense in a world that often seemed senseless. Today, both Pavel and Captain Volkov are alive and healthy because two men chose mercy over hatred at the moment when that choice mattered most. Dr. Mikhail Petrov learned that sometimes our greatest enemies are actually our greatest teachers, showing us who we really are when everything we believe is tested by reality. This story reminds us that in a world full of conflict and division, the power to choose compassion over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and mercy over revenge remains the most fundamentally human thing we can do. Because sometimes, the person you're prepared to hate is actually the person you should be thanking. And sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but discovering they were never your enemy at all.